They say the forest has its own language, not a language of words, but of whispers. Of the wind rattling dry autumn leaves, of a distant stream murmuring over stones, of the slow, patient crackling of old trees shifting in the cold. And for those who listen closely, sometimes the forest speaks directly to the heart. It was late October, 2022, when David set out alone into the Montana backcountry. 58 years old, retired after 3 decades as a firefighter, David had seen more than his share of noise and chaos. He loved the quiet now, craved it really. Out here among the towering pines and snow-dusted ridges, his mind could finally breathe. The sun hung low in the sky that day, casting long golden streaks through the trees. With every step, David's boots crunched softly over the frosted trail. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, sharp and clean. The kind of cold that wakes you up, that reminds you you're alive. And for a while all was still, but then, a sound broke the quiet. At first, David thought it was the wind shifting, maybe a tree groaning under early snow, but no. There it was again, low, guttural, uneven, almost like a sob. David froze, his breath caught. He knew these woods. He knew the animals that roamed them. Elk, deer, foxes, and yes, bears, grizzlies. And in this part of Montana, that was no small thing. His heart thudded in his chest as his mind raced. Do I turn back? Do I hide? But something about the sound stopped him. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't the rumble of a predator staking its claim. No, it was something else. There was pain in that sound. A raw, aching pain that cut through fear and straight into David's gut. He took a breath, steadying himself, and stepped carefully toward the noise. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around. Every survival manual he'd ever read warned, avoid, stay back, protect yourself first. But there was a voice in him, quiet but insistent, that said, listen. As he made his way through the underbrush, the sound grew clearer. Sharp, stuttering gasps. A frantic scraping against earth and wood. David rounded a stand of trees and stopped dead in his tracks. There, just 20 yards ahead, lay a massive grizzly bear. Its thick brown coat was matted and dusted with snow. One of its powerful legs was twisted, caught in a tangle of old wire and fallen branches. The animal was panting hard, its massive sides heaving, its eyes wide, not with rage, but with panic. David's mouth went dry. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the ragged cries in front of him. For a long moment man and beast locked eyes, and in that instant David felt something shift deep inside him. This wasn't a monster, this wasn't a threat waiting to strike. This was a living creature in pain, terrified, vulnerable. He realized then, fear doesn't always tell the truth, and sometimes the hardest and most human thing we can do is to see beyond it. David exhaled slowly, pulling out his phone with trembling fingers. His thumb hovered over the screen. Do I call? Do I risk bringing people here? Do I walk away and pretend I never saw this? He knew one thing for certain. This moment would change everything. They say life can change in an instant, but what they don't tell you is how quiet that instant can be. As David stepped carefully over a fallen log, the world around him seemed to hold its breath. The cries, now closer, clearer, cut through the stillness like a knife. He crouched behind a pine, heart pounding so hard it felt like his ribs might burst. Peeking through the branches, his eyes widened. There, just yards away, was the bear. A massive grizzly, its thick fur glistening with frost, paw twisted in an old steel snare buried under a tangle of branches. Its chest heaved as it tried to pull free, the metal biting deeper into flesh with every movement. David's first instinct was to back away, slowly, quietly, to get to safety. This is crazy, he whispered under his breath. What are you doing, David? But then, the bear lifted its head, and in that single glance, everything shifted. Its eyes weren't wild with fury. They were wide with fear. It let out a guttural sound, almost like a moan, a sound David would later describe as not human, but heartbreakingly close. David took a shaky breath. Okay, he murmured to himself, pulling his phone from his jacket. His fingers were stiff with cold, trembling as he fumbled with the screen. He dialed. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Emergency Line, what's your situation? came the operator's voice. I found a grizzly. It's trapped, snare on its leg. I think it's bad. Real bad, David said, his voice shaking. As he spoke, the bear let out another low cry, a sound so raw, so filled with panic that David's throat tightened. He forced himself to stay calm, reading off his location as best he could. The operator's voice was steady. "Stay back. Help is on the way. Do not approach the animal. Can you stay on the line?" "I'm here," David whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." For the next hour, David waited. Every minute stretched thin, his breath fogging in the cold. Every time the bear struggled, the snare bit deeper, and David flinched, as if it were his own flesh being torn. "Hang in there, big guy," he murmured more than once, voice soft, almost prayerful. "Help's coming." Finally, the crackle of radios, the snap of branches, the wildlife team arrived. 3 officers in heavy coats and bright orange vests moved quickly, their eyes sharp, their voices calm but firm. "Sir, we need you back. You've done enough." David backed away reluctantly, his boots crunching in the snow as he retreated behind a tree, but his eyes never left the bear. The officers moved with practiced precision. Tranquilizer dart, poles, thick leather gloves. "Easy, big fella. We're gonna get you out of this." As they worked, David's chest tightened. So many things could go wrong. A misfired dart, a panicked lunge, a tragic ending. But as the tranquilizer took hold, the great animal's thrashing slowed, its massive body sagging into the earth with a long, exhausted sigh. For a heartbeat, everything was still. And then, something David would never forget. As the officers moved closer, one of them gently touched the bear's massive shoulder. "You're okay now," the man murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You're okay." David watched, heart in his throat, as the team began cutting away the snare, the brutal coil of steel that had nearly cost the bear its life. In that moment, David realized, this wasn't just a rescue. It was a rare, fleeting moment of connection, between humans and the wild, between fear and compassion. "We weren't meant to understand each other," David would later tell a friend, "but for a little while out there, it sure felt like we did."
They say when you're standing on the edge of something big, something life-changing, time starts to stretch. That's exactly how it felt for David as he stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the wildlife team work. The bear, tranquilized but still breathing heavily, lay slumped against the earth, its enormous chest rising and falling in slow, uneven rhythms. Its paw, the one caught in the snare, was grotesquely swollen, the metal biting so deep it had nearly disappeared beneath flesh. David wrapped his arms around himself, trying to block out the cold. But it wasn't the Montana chill making him shiver. It was something deeper, a knot of helplessness twisted tight in his gut. How could something like this happen? He wondered. Out here, in the middle of nowhere. Who left this trap? How long has it been suffering? Sir, you okay? Yeah, just watching. You've done a good thing today. Not many people would have stopped. The officers worked swiftly, but carefully. One monitored the bear's vitals, heart rate, breathing, while another prepared the heavy-duty bolt cutters. A third knelt by the bear's head, speaking in a low, soothing voice as if the animal could still hear. Then came the real test. The lead officer positioned the cutters over the steel coil, glancing at his team. "On my mark, steady." David held his breath. With a sharp metallic clang, the first piece of the snare gave way, the tension in the wire snapping back with a whip-like crack. The bear's body jerked instinctively, even under sedation. For a split second, chaos threatened. Respiration spiking, hold him steady. "Easy, big guy, easy." David's heart pounded in his ears as he watched, fingers digging into the bark of the tree beside him. Come on," he whispered under his breath. The second cut was harder. The steel had bitten so deep it was nearly fused to bone. The officer gritted his teeth, leaning his full weight into the cutters. Finally, with a groan of metal and a sharp crack, the last piece of the snare fell away. But it wasn't over. The bear's breathing became shallow, its massive head twitching slightly. The tranquilizer was wearing off, faster than expected. "We need to move, let's get clear." David stumbled back instinctively, his boots slipping slightly in the snow. His chest tightened as he watched the officers retreat in a practiced, coordinated sweep. And then, the waiting began. The bear stirred, its paw twitching, its head lifting weakly from the ground. For a moment, its eyes flickered open. dull at first, unfocused. Then sharper, more aware. David watched, breathless, as the great animal struggled to understand its freedom. It looked down at its leg, at the raw, bloodied paw no longer bound by steel, and gave a low, almost puzzled grunt. Then slowly it shifted its weight, pushing itself upright with a groan of effort. Is it going to make it, officer? We're about to find out. The bear took one step, then another, wobbling, staggering slightly. Its breath came in harsh bursts, each movement a visible struggle. But it kept going. David could hardly believe what he was seeing. The officers remained still, watching silently. No one moved. No one dared break the fragile spell of the moment. Then, from the edge of the tree line, came a sound none of them expected. A soft chuffing noise. Two smaller shapes emerged cautiously from the brush. Cubs. David felt his chest tighten, his eyes stinging with sudden emotion. Oh my God, it has a family. The bear paused, lifting its massive head toward the sound. For a long moment it simply stood there, chest heaving, battered but unbroken. And then, with a final glance toward the humans who had freed it, the grizzly turned. Step by halting step it moved toward the tree line. The cubs rushed forward, nuzzling at its legs, chuffing softly as if to say, "Where have you been?" David pressed a hand over his mouth, swallowing hard. In that moment, the forest no longer felt like a wild, untamed place. It felt like a cathedral. "They're going to be okay." David responded, Yeah, they are." David watched, heart full, as the mother bear shuffled slowly toward her cubs. The moment felt sacred, fragile. The officers stood frozen, barely breathing. David felt an odd ache in his chest. Part relief, part awe, part something he couldn't quite name. But then, without warning, the calm shattered. From the far side of the clearing came a sharp metallic crack. David jerked his head around. So did the officers. Another trap. In that heartbeat, everything changed. One of the cubs, curious or panicked, had stumbled into another hidden snare, an old, rusted device half buried in the snow. The mother bear spun, roaring in fury, pain, and terror. The officers scrambled, shouting instructions, waving their arms, trying to stay calm but ready for the worst. No. The mother lunged toward the cub, but the injured leg buckled under her weight. She stumbled, letting out a heart-wrenching moan, while the trapped cub thrashed, its tiny body jerking wildly. "Get the dart gun! We've got a cub caught! We need to calm her down before we can help!" The tension in the clearing was electric. The mother bear's roars filled the air, echoing off the trees like the crack of thunder. David pressed his back to a pine, chest heaving. He could feel the animal's grief, raw, primal, overwhelming. The officers moved in fast. One loaded a tranquilizer dart, hands trembling as he tried to steady his aim. "Lead officer, hold your fire until I say." David could barely stand to watch. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but his heart wouldn't let him. The cub's cries pierced the air. The mother limped closer, nuzzling frantically, trying to bite at the wire, but her injured paw was useless. David clenched his fists. "David, come on, you can't let it end like this." Then, a sharp whistle. The dart hit. The mother bear shuddered, spinning wildly, snarling at the humans, and then, slowly, staggeringly, crumpled to the ground beside her cub. David found himself stepping forward without thinking. "Officer, stay back, sir." But David didn't hear. He saw the cub's wide, terrified eyes, its tiny leg twisted in the metal, and all he could think was, "David, not again." Working with practiced urgency, the team got to the cub, one man speaking in a low, calming voice, another working the snare with bolt cutters. David stood just at the edge, heart in his throat, watching as the wire gave way with a harsh snap. The cub bolted free, scampering immediately to its mother's side, nuzzling into her thick fur as though trying to wake her. David felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. "Officer, you did good, sir." David, "No, they did." They waited. Slowly, the tranquilizer wore off. The mother's great head lifted slightly, eyes glassy but aware. She shifted her weight, wincing, but alive. The cubs pressed close, chuffing and nuzzling, their small bodies trembling. David exhaled, feeling the release of tension in his own bones. A release so sudden it left him lightheaded. Sometimes, he thought, survival isn't just about strength. It's about having someone who won't give up on you. As the bears moved slowly toward the forest edge, David turned to the lead officer. "David, how many of those traps are out here?" "Officer, too many. Folks set him and forget him. We pull him when we find him, but he trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. David looked back at the clearing. The flattened snow, the torn wire, the marks of struggle and survival written across the earth. It hit him then with the quiet force of truth. This was a victory, but it was only one battle in a larger fight. As the bears disappeared into the trees, David felt something stir deep in his chest. A mix of relief, sorrow, and a quiet growing resolve. Because sometimes the unthinkable isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the part that makes you decide to change the world.
They say some moments stay with you forever, not because they were loud, but because they were quiet in a way that changed you. That's exactly how it felt in the clearing, as David watched the exhausted Grizzly lift her massive head. The cubs, huddled tight against her, chirped softly, their tiny muzzles nuzzling her thick fur. For the first time in hours, the only sounds were the rustle of pine needles in the wind and the shallow, raspy breath of a mother who had almost been lost. David exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to his chest as if to steady his own racing heart. "David, Vio. She made it," he whispered. "They made it." The wildlife team moved with quiet precision, checking the mother's breathing, her injured leg making sure the tranquilizer had worn off safely. They spoke in hushed voices, their years of experience etched into every calm, deliberate movement. David watched as one officer knelt near the bear, whispering almost tenderly, "You're okay now, big girl, you're okay. Let's get you home." It was the kind of voice a parent uses when waking a sick child, gentle, full of care, more comfort than command. Slowly, the mother bear pushed herself onto her good leg, groaning softly. For a terrifying second, her injured paw buckled, and she crashed back down into the snow. David's breath caught in his throat. Come on," he murmured under his breath, fists clenching at his sides. The cubs nuzzled her face, pawed at her ear, whimpered with tiny high-pitched sounds that pierced straight through David's chest. And then, with a deep, rumbling breath, the mother bear tried again. Muscle by muscle, inch by inch, she hauled herself up. The injured paw hovered slightly off the ground, trembling, but she stood, battered, staggering, but on her feet. The clearing felt like it was holding its breath. David felt tears prick his eyes, unexpected and fierce. "She's walking," he whispered. "She's walking." With painful, halting steps, the mother bear began to limp toward the trees. The cubs scrambled to her side, their tiny paws leaving delicate tracks alongside her massive ones. Every step looked like a battle, but she kept going. She paused once at the edge of the trees, her great head turning ever so slightly back toward the humans. David swore later that their eyes met for just a moment, one of those rare moments where the wild and the human world touch, not with words, but with something older, deeper, unspoken. It wasn't gratitude exactly, it was recognition. A moment that said, "You saw me, you didn't turn away." David watched until the last flicker of brown fur disappeared between the trees. Only then did he realize he'd been holding his breath. The clearing felt different now. Where there had been chaos, pain, and fear, there was only quiet, and the long, jagged scars in the snow where survival had left its mark. One of the officers clapped David on the shoulder, his glove cold but his grip warm. "Not many people would have done what you did today," he said quietly. David gave a shaky laugh. "I almost didn't," the officer smiled. "That's what makes it count." As the team gathered their equipment, David lingered. His eyes scanned the edge of the forest, searching for one last glimpse of fur, one last sign. But the bears were gone. All that remained were their tracks, crisscrossing the clearing like a story written in the snow. David crouched, brushing his fingers across one of the prints. His breath fogged in the cold air as he closed his eyes and let the moment settle deep into his bones. "We came here for solitude," he thought, "but sometimes the world comes looking for you, and asks you to be more than just a witness." As the last of the team's vehicles pulled away, David remained standing at the tree line, watching the forest breathe, listening to its hush. He knew this moment wouldn't leave him, he would carry it. The sound of the bear's cries, the sight of its limping stride, the fierce, desperate love of a mother and her cubs for the rest of his life. And maybe he thought that was the point of moments like this, not to change the wild, but to let the wild change you. That night, back at his cabin, David sat by the fire, staring into the flickering glow as if the flames held answers. He should have felt nothing but relief. But something stirred restlessly in his chest. The image of the mother bear limping into the forest replayed over and over in his mind. But it wasn't just the rescue that haunted him, it was the trap. The second snare, the one none of them had seen coming. David leaned forward, rubbing his hands over his face. He couldn't shake the question pressing at him. How many more were still out there? The next morning, as the sun crept over the mountaintops, David made a decision. He called the wildlife office. "I want to help," he told them. There was a pause on the line. "Most people just move on," the officer said quietly. "They don't usually call back." But David's voice was steady. Well, maybe they should. A week later, David found himself hiking the same ridge, only this time he wasn't alone. He walked beside a small crew of wildlife officials and volunteers, eyes scanning the ground for the cruel glint of metal among the roots and rocks. What they found startled even the most seasoned officer. In just 2 days, they pulled more than a dozen abandoned snares from the hills, some rusted and half-buried, others frighteningly new. David felt his stomach twist as he yanked another wire from the frozen ground. "We walk these trails thinking we're alone out here," he thought. But the truth is, the wild is watching, and sometimes it needs us to step up. The real twist of this story wasn't just that David saved a bear, it was that the bear saved David. It woke something in him, a fierce sense of responsibility, a connection to something larger than himself. By winter's end, David had joined a local conservation group. He spent his weekends trekking the same ridges, scanning for traps, clearing debris, and speaking to local hikers about the hidden dangers they so often missed. And sometimes, when the forest was quiet, he'd pause at the edge of a clearing, scanning the trees. He never saw the bear again. But in his heart he carried her with him. The reminder that sometimes the smallest moment of courage can ripple outward in ways you never expect. They say nature has a way of healing itself, but what they don't often say is, sometimes it needs a little help from us. Months had passed since that day in the forest. Winter had loosened its grip on Montana's mountains, and the land was waking up again. Snowmelt trickled through the gullies, the trees stood proud in their green coats, and the trails once empty were again scattered with footprints. Hikers, wanderers, dreamers, seeking quiet. David found himself back on that same trail one morning in April, walking with measured steps, eyes scanning the ground out of habit. But this time, it wasn't just vigilance that brought him here, it was gratitude. He stopped at the edge of the clearing where it had all begun. The snow was gone now, replaced by soft grass and the early buds of wildflowers. The scars in the earth where the bear had struggled and the officers had worked were slowly fading, but not in David's memory. He crouched for a moment, fingertips brushing the ground where her paw prints had once been. David whispered softly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You taught me something, about what it means to stay when every part of you wants to walk away." David stood, breathing in the crisp spring air. As the wind moved through the trees, he closed his eyes and let the quiet settle over him like a blessing. He thought about the dozens of traps they had cleared since that day, about the team of volunteers who now walked these woods alongside him, about the children from the local school who had come to learn about wildlife safety. One act of courage had become a ripple, touching lives, raising awareness, changing the way people moved through this place. David understood now. We are never as separate from nature as we like to think. We are part of it, its stewards, its protectors, its sometimes clumsy, sometimes tender companions. He smiled, remembering something the lead officer had told him that day. "You can't save everything," the man had said, "but you can save something. And sometimes, that's enough to change the world you're standing in." As David turned to head home, he paused once more, casting a long glance toward the trees. Somewhere out there, he imagined, was a mother bear and her 2 cubs, thriving, surviving, because on one cold autumn day, a man chose to listen instead of run. He lifted his hand in a quiet, almost unconscious gesture, not a wave exactly, but a silent acknowledgement. "Be well," he murmured, voice rough with emotion. "Be wild, be free." If this story moved you, if it stirred something in your heart, take a moment to reflect. Courage over comfort. When was the last time you chose courage over comfort? Listen to the world. When was the last time you stopped and really listened to the world around you? Share your reflections. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections or your own experiences with nature in the comments below. And if you want to hear more true stories of courage, compassion, and connection, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together, let's keep these stories alive and remind each other of the quiet power we all carry inside.